Hi, I'm Tiffany Young for IdeateTV, and I'm here with Luke Gygax. And he just got out of a panel, and I just had to wait in line to get to talk to him. So thank you so much for talking to us today.
Oh yeah, thank you for taking your time to talk to me. I appreciate it.
Of course. So our first question that we're dying to know is, what was it like being the son of Gary Gygax?
You know, I get that question a lot, and for me, it was like totally normal because that was my dad. That's what I grew up doing. But obviously, as I grew older and got to meet more people, I realized what a unique, environment that I grew up in. It was really, I think, a wonderful legacy that I'm getting to carry on. I grew up playing games with my dad. That was what my dad liked to do. So some people might go fishing, hunting, or do those sorts of things. I grew up, with dice in my hand at a gaming table since my earliest memories are of doing that. And of course, because he loved games, and he liked all kinds of games. Whether it was cribbage or war game or miniatures, everything was kind of a game for him. So even when we would get out, we moved to a new house and we had a bigger yard, and so we bought a new lawnmower, and then there was an old one in the back corner of the garage. So we got both of them out, and we started up, and we saw which one would go faster. That was, our games like to race each other in there. So everything was kind of a game, and it was fun, and he was just a big kid. So I think that was really cool. And I got to play test a lot of iconic adventure scenarios and help play test rules that all, came out in first edition Dungeons and Dragons, or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. That's what I spent a lot of my youth doing. So it was really neat. And I'm lucky enough to be able to consider some folks who are kind of like my uncles are, guys that folks might recognize from the old days of designing games. Tim Kask, Jim Ward. They're like uncles Tom Wam. All those guys were hanging around and kind of like family members to a certain extent because we interacted so much. So it was a really cool childhood, but at the time I just thought that was normal.
Right.
Yeah.
And did you have like childhood friends that like got to get in on that too? And they must have thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it was actually pretty cool that friends would be able to just come over and hang out and play with us. My dad was always very welcoming. So especially like later in life, especially when I was an adult, I remember this more so. I was going to college and we'd game every Thursday. Well, sometimes people would just look up where my dad lived, and they'd come and knock on the door and go like, "Is this Gary Gygax's house?" He's like, "Yes." He's like, "I'm Gary Gygax," and they'd be like, "Oh, I just wanted to tell you how much your game meant to me, and it's really an honor to meet you." And he'd be like, "Okay, yeah, come on in and sit down on the porch. I've got a minute or whatever." And so he might, just depending if he didn't have anything going on, he'd come in, have some iced tea or whatever, and he'd wrap it and be like, I got to get back to doing some stuff, but I have a game on Thursday and I have a spot open, so if you want to come play. And they're like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah," and so they'd come and play games with my dad.
So he was just so welcoming to everyone.
Yeah, because gamers are generally friendly people, and if you're going to sit down around the gaming table with people, it's a welcoming environment. And that's one thing is like I had a very diverse group of friends growing up because I don't care if I'm hanging out with particularly nerdy guys or athletic people or whatever. It doesn't really matter. If they had an interest in gaming, we all had something in common, and so we could relate to one another. And I think that's a great thing about gaming is it brings us all together.
Definitely. So as you've been in this gaming industry for basically your whole life,
Yes.
Can you tell us like what the panel that you were speaking at, like give the viewers at home like a little bit of a sneak peek at what you were talking about?
Sure. So I was talking about the history of Dungeons and Dragons, which is, it's like I said, growing up, I took everything for granted. This is just my family. This is life. When my dad passed away in 2008, I came to realize there was a huge outpouring, and people talked to me and all of my family members and said, "Your dad, inspired me in this way." Whether it was I had a learning disability and I was so passionate about Dungeons and Dragons and gaming that I learned to overcome this, and now I'm a doctor. Or I was so afraid to talk to anybody, I couldn't do it. I was like painfully shy, and it was through this game and role-playing that I was able to talk to other people. Or directors and writers, and wow, you taught me the creative process, and I learned to love and be a creator. And so this was that gateway for them. This was that tool, and they just were so thankful for that. And I didn't really realize the impact on wider culture until I thought about it, and he was no longer here. And certainly I think other folks recognize that, and I think there's a upsurge or upswell now that there's a renaissance of D&D. we're seeing that, in the 1970s and 80s, you were considered, a nerd and a geek, and you were ostracized if you played Dungeons and Dragons or some kind of, pencil neck geek. But now the geeks have inherited the earth, and those folks who grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons are now in charge of your billions of dollars video games, your movies, what you're watching, reading, and seeing, and all that creative process. So we're seeing a resurgence there, and I think they know who my father is, and part of what I want to do is let other people know who my father is too, and how important he was to gaming. If Dungeons and Dragons, the rules, the whole idea of what a role-playing game is, role-playing didn't exist until Dungeons and Dragons. So prior to D&D coming out, games were adversarial. You were competing against somebody. There was a winner and a loser. It was set within the confines of a board, and a scenario. So there was no continuous storyline going on. Whereas Dungeons and Dragons, it's cooperative, it's open-ended, and very, very creative. You're not bound by those things. And I think there's a lot of benefits to that to people, as far as learning skill sets and things you don't even realize. Confidence, improvisation. Public speaking, persuasiveness, problem solving. There's all sorts of really wonderful bits in role playing, and Dungeons and Dragons was that first game. Also, just the mechanics of your video games. People, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, hit points, sure. Well, that didn't exist until Dungeons and Dragons made that popular. The idea of a leveling up, that was captured through experience points was Dungeons and Dragons. Armor class, or classes in general, like I'm a fighter, I'm a magic user. What monsters look like, and putting statistics to types of monsters and kind of codifying them. That's a lot of what my dad did, and all that is carried on in your World of Warcraft being a very popular version. And certainly people have tweaked it and made it into their own things, but their roots, that's all rooted in Dungeons and Dragons, and people don't know that now, and it's weird. So there's a great story there. I think my family story is wonderful. It was
incredible. I love reading about your family.
Yeah, and it's really my dad believed in something in this game, and he put everything he had into it. We were desperately poor, and then Dungeons and Dragons, there were food stamps, hand-me-down clothes, the whole thing. And for then this game hit, and my dad became very wealthy. And then of course the tragedy is because he was poor, he had partners that he brought in, and he was a shoe repairman. He wasn't a business person. He didn't protect his game separate from the company. So when someone came and bought a majority stock in his company, they were able to kick him out of the company and take all his creations. And so, when he passed away, he had none of it. He didn't own any of those things. And so it was really rags to riches, and then a tragic, decline. Now, his legacy is creating Dungeons and Dragons and mentoring a lot of creative people and being there for them. So it's just something that I would like to tell people about, and for them to know about it and not to forget those roots.